All right, so here's where we're going to go through the this particular project and then sort of go over how to make it work. So starting off, you have the h1 of random puppies, and then I changed this to say how many puppies do you want, because that's a little more descriptive. You could also add a label that says that, however you wish to style and handle that particular thing. And so the important selectors that we have here is the form selector, so this is what actually submits things, and then the two input selectors. This one, since the type submit, it fires off the submit event for the form, and then we have the input with an ID of number of puppies, and we set it to type number. Then we have a hidden section, which does not look like it's closed out correctly. So let me do that. There we go. If you do not correctly close out your tags, then the browser will attempt to do it for you, but it's not always it does not always work the way you wish it did. In my case, I got lucky. So we have our sections closed out now, and then we have our div container. Then we load in jQuery, and after we load in jQuery, we load in our custom JavaScript. So starting at the top, we have an immediately invoked function executable, the IFI, and what this does is that you see this use strict here. Well, use strict doesn't actually do anything if it's not inside of a function. What happens normally in JavaScript is, let's say I make something called message equals some message. Well, when JavaScript sees there's no variable or let or const keyword here, what it does is it says, well, you must mean this. And use strict disallows this. Use strict requires that you must have the var, const, or let keyword inside, for any variable declaration. So it does not put things on the global object. But if you are not inside of a function, using the var keyword does absolutely nothing, because those variables get hoisted to the top, which means they become part of the window anyway. So you would have window, get dog image, display results, etc. And then if someone else wrote a image source or display results function, it would overwrite yours, and that would cause problems. So this prevents what's called global namespace collision. And that's the goal of this, is to encapsulate, which is another fancy word you're going to hear. It allows us to encapsulate the logic in between these two areas. And the way an IFI works is it's a function, and the way you invoke a function is with this symbol here. So this symbol right here wraps it, and that tells JavaScript that it's an unnamed anonymous function. And then this part says to immediately execute that function that we just created. Most of the programming languages don't have anything like this, but that's because JavaScript is very special and has something called lexical scope. And lexical scope means that the scope is defined by functions most of the time instead of bound by blocks. Or braces, which is this. Const and let are block scoped. Versus lexical scope. Okay, so now we have our form, and jQuery recommends that you use .on instead of calling the event directly, and that's just because so many new events get added to HTML5 spec over time and all the new stuff that they don't want to have to constantly create new methods to match all the different event listeners. So they say just use on as the sort of global event listener. And so whenever this form gets submitted, so without a dot and without an hashtag, what we get here is find the HTML tag called form versus the ID called form or the class called form. When you find that, listen for the submit event, and then whenever that event gets fired, call prevent default, and then get the dog image. You don't need to worry about the page being loaded, because this is the last thing on here. So the form element will exist before it gets to this line of code. If you were to move these two lines of code up and put them like right here, for example, then you would need to listen for the DOM loaded event to make sure that all of the content exists on the page before you pull in your JavaScript. Because it requires extra code written, and also because the way JavaScript works, unless you put the async or deferred tags on it, is that it halts the rendering of the web page until all the JavaScript is loaded in. So by having it at the very bottom here, you are ensuring that that the page itself exists before you try to call JavaScript on it, and you prevent it from blocking. So they don't just look at a white page, they get all the content first, then they get the waiting for the behavior to load. Okay, so once we submit this event, we call getDogImage. And the first thing we need from the getDogImage is we need to know how many puppies there are. And the way we do that inside of jQuery, let's clear this out. Is first we select the element. You'll see here that this tells us there is one ID of num puppies, which is correct. And then we call .val on it. And right now the value is empty, but if we add values, we now see it's 4. This is completely equivalent to doing this inside of vanilla JavaScript. So this is what's called the value, and let's just show that in action. The reason why that works. So let's say I set value equal to 1, like so. Run it, and now you see that 1 is the default value that gets loaded in. So now if I reload this, and check it out, this is a fun thing called the shadow DOM, but this value here corresponds to this value down here. Clear it out. All right. So once we have the value here, we use string interpolation to put the results into here. So the number goes there to select the number of random images. And the way that works is that string interpolation just takes a string of any value. And it takes this value here and injects the content of it so that you get this. And that's what we want for here because we want to get the number of puppies selected. Then we take the response and we get the JSON part of it, which is the body of it versus the headers like the status code and status. And then we display the results. And that happens right here. You don't need to name this response JSON. It can be called anything, but that's the value that gets passed in right here. And then I like to use this form for console logging things because it makes it very clear what's part of this versus any other piece. And the more you log stuff out, the more you're going to want to know where it is in the code you're actually logging it. So we pull the message object, or we pull the message array off the response JSON object. Then we're creating an empty string called images. And then we're saying if array to is array message, which in this case it will always be true. But it's important to know what this does. So this only runs if this is an array. And that's because JavaScript's built-in types, array is not its own thing. Arrays are types of objects inside of JavaScript. So this special array to is array is a way of testing it. Before this existed, you had to do all sorts of other weird stuff to see whether or not something is an actual array. But once you do know that it's an array, you then take the images and you run message.reduce on the array. Reduce takes two parts. The first is the accumulator. So this is the value, the end result value, and then cur, which is the current item in the array. So 0, 1, 2, etc. That's what the current result is. You throw a comma on it, and then you pass in what you want the initial value of the accumulator to be. So this is saying the accumulator, first time it runs, should be an empty string. And then we say we add to that empty string the results of calling image source with the current thing. And here you can see that the two names between here and here don't need to match at all. So the image source takes in an SRC component and it returns this image with all the classes on it to make sure that they are centered and that they have margin on them. Let's add more doggos so we can see that. So it makes sure that they can add more margin right there. If it's not an array, then we're just going to call image source on the message itself, which again, for how this API works, this is never going to be true, but it's just good practice. Then we call the replace content.html. So this is the find something, and then this is the do something. Now it's important to note that you have two ways of doing this. So in the first way, I'm going to find this container fluid class. So I'm using the dot selector. And I'm going to take the HTML content, say I am overriding content. And you can see that right here, I am overriding content is true. But you see that the div class of container fluid still exists. So this container is still there, but the contents inside of that container have been replaced. If, however, I were to use replace with, now you can see that the styling changed and that styling changed because now that div was completely thrown away. 99% of the time you're going to want .html, not .replace with. But it is handy to know that it exists and what it does, but it's just not very commonly used. Normally you have a placeholder and you have some styling on that placeholder, so if you throw away the placeholder, you just end up with an ugly thing, right? And then once we've replaced the content, we then say that we want to find the results and we want to remove the class hidden. So what that does is that goes right here. So there's results in hidden. Hidden hides everything upon initial load. So reload this. So that makes sure that all that's gone. And then only after is actually fetched the items that we're looking for, which we can see in the network request tab. So I'm going to pull this up, I'm going to clear it out, reload it. Right. And then we do this, and you can see here is the URL called. There's our string interpolation happening. And this is the response header. So this is all the stuff that the server is sending back to us. The most commonly used one is the status code, 200 meaning OK. And the request headers are what we sent to them. When we hit preview, we see the message body that we got. And the message body is status is success. And the message is an array containing all the different images. And so that's what it looks like. So that's the response.json. And that's what we need to call .message to get the message off, because we don't really care about the status so much. And so with that, that is all of the important pieces of JavaScript. There is a little bit of CSS, and those just do a couple of things, like make sure that .hidden has a display of none, so it hides things, that the maximum height and width is 500 pixels, to keep things roughly the same size, and then to make sure that we have a margin bottom of 2 rem here and here. And this is the main piece. The flex column says to put things in a column, so it's up top to bottom instead of a row, which is left to right. And then it aligns the items by centering them. So flex makes it really easy to center items and do a couple other things that are more difficult using divs and other traditional elements. So that is the assignment and how you run through it.